This week we have a double portion with which we conclude the 4 books of Moses. I said 4 books of Moses. We all know that there were 5 books, but the truth of the matter is that the 5th book, Deuteronomy, is a restatement, a restatement or repetition of the first 4 books. That's why it's called Mishnah Torah, the repetition of the Torah. So in a certain sense, the body of the books of Moses contain actually 4 books. So this week we're going to be concluding the 4th book, and in a way it's like the conclusion of a substantial part of the Torah. The 2 portions are Matos and Masei. Matos begins with the instructions that Moses gave the leaders of the tribes, and that's what the word Matos means, the tribes, that they should be responsible for a specific area of Jewish law that we'll discuss a little bit later. That's what the Parsha begins with. Masei details the journeys of the Jewish people in the desert, 42 journeys. Now, the names themselves have significance. The Rebbe would always emphasize that the name of something is not just an arbitrary word because it's the opening word of a parsha. Sometimes it's not even the opening word, but sometimes it's the most significant word. But even that doesn't capture what the name is. A name represents what the very content, what the very substance of the parsha is all about. You look at a name, it tells you the character of that parsha. Well, the parsha Matos and Masei in this double portion are actually 2 sides of one coin. They are a paradox. Matos comes from a word that means a stick, a staff, a branch of a tree. The tribes were called branches, but there are 2 ways of saying the word branch. One is shevet and one is mate. Mate implies when a branch is formed into a firm and solid stick, unbending stick. And then Masei, on the other hand, refers to journeys, fluidity, something that's moving, that's never staying in one place. And the Rebbe would always emphasize that these are 2 sides of one coin, that Judaism consists of 2 approaches that are both necessary. One approach is standing steadfastly strong, unbending, unyielding when it comes to matters of principle, when it comes to matters of virtue. We do not bend, we do not compromise. Yet, that doesn't mean that we are standing in one place. In matters of holiness, we're constantly journeying, constantly traveling, going from one level to another, never being satisfied with carving out a comfortable niche in our spiritual lives. Just like most people who are healthy don't say, well, I'm healthy enough, I don't want to become more healthy. People who have basic needs taken care of, they don't say, most cases, I have enough for myself, I don't want to make any more money. Most areas of life that are positive, people want more of it. But when it comes to spirituality and virtue, we find that the same people will feel comfortable carving out their niche. So we have Matos. In certain areas you are unbending, unyielding, you're inflexible. In some areas you're completely fluid, always traveling, always going from one place to another. Now, I just want to take this concept, these 2 aspects of it, and apply it to real conflicts that exist within families, communities, countries. Very often when the interests of 2 parties conflict, and it's very hard for one party to say, I'm going to yield and I'm going to give in to you. But I think there's a certain formula that people should use and could resolve many conflicts. If I have certain interests, you have certain interests, and they clash, then we have to work it out to see how we can compromise. And compromise is always a good thing when it comes to self-interest. But let's say I have a need that's based on principle. It's based not on my desires, not on my interests, but on my principles that may even go against my desires and my interests. I would rather not have to do it, but this is a principle, so I stand very strongly attached to it. The other person, on the other hand, who is in conflict with me, is fighting for his or her interest. We should always know that we should always be prepared to compromise and give in when it comes to interest versus someone who has principle. That's it. When it is matos, when you're dealing with something that is solid, that's like a staff, it can't be bent, it can't be changed. The other side should always be prepared to be fluid, to be willing to change their own interests and yield to the other. That itself becomes a principle. That itself becomes a positive. Now they tell the story of someone sitting in a theater and he's wearing this huge hat, this cowboy hat, and blocking the view of the people behind him. And they ask him politely at first to please remove the hat. He refuses. And then when they start to ask him a little bit more stridently and he still refuses, and they say, "Why don't you want to take off your hat?" He said, "It's a matter of principle." So someone lifts off his hat and throws it to the other side of the theater, and they realized that he had a bald head. He had no hair. And they said, "Don't cover up your hair with principles." What this little anecdote relates is that very often people take their own interests and they turn them into matos. They turn them into staffs. This is the way it has to be. This is my principle. My principle is what I do, what I feel convenient, what satisfies my desires, what satisfies and fulfills my interests, what I consider to be my needs. That's taking the Masei, the areas we should be fluid and flexible, and turning it into matos, into something solid. And the same way, conversely, when a person says that they're going to constantly change their values. Today, they'll do something that they feel is wrong, but tomorrow they'll say, "Well, today I'm fine with it." And be fluid in the wrong way. We have to know where to be matos, where to be masei. Now, what is the subject matter of matos? It's about an area of Jewish law called neder, a vow. When a person makes a vow, they have to keep it. Kol hayotzim mipiv yasim. Whatever comes out of their mouth, they must do. Unfortunately, we're living in a society where people make promises, they make commitments, and they don't keep them. Judaism is very strong on keeping commitments, especially if they're expressed in the way of an oath, of a vow. And the Talmud tells us some contradictory things about people who make vows. On one hand, the Talmud says that why would you want to make a vow not to do something, not to eat something, if that thing is kosher? It's enough that what the Torah told you that you can't eat. Why do you have to add on more prohibitions? And then there are other sources in the Torah that seem to suggest that a person should be restricted. They should not try to indulge. They should add on to the restrictions that the Torah gives us. And the basic answer is the distinction between a person who's a tzaddik, a person who's completely righteous, who has lost their desire for materialistic things. They could partake of anything, because what they're doing is taking the material and the physical and elevating it. So anyone who is able to engage in physical pleasures, but they do it with the understanding that it's intended to make them capable of serving God in a better way, then that's a kosher thing, and one should not restrict. On the other hand, when a person feels that it's being pulled down to lower levels because of indulgences, that's the person who should make vows to restrict it. At any rate, the Torah then tells us that this is not written explicitly in the Torah. The Talmud infers it from various words in the Parsha and in other places, that the power to make vows is countered by the power to annul vows. If someone makes a vow and then they regret doing it, they go to 3 rabbis. The rabbis ask the person, if you would have known that this would have happened, that you made the vow, and you would have never made the vow, they have the ability, the person says, yes, if I would have known, I would have not made the vow, to release the person, to annul that vow. That is a power that is not mentioned explicitly in the Torah, but it's been preserved to us in the oral tradition. We all know that Yom Kippur is the holiest day of the year. What do we do before Yom Kippur? At the beginning of the service, we say Kol Nidre, where we renounce and annul our vows. And one of the questions that have been dealt with by many, many great scholars over the ages is why would they include a legalistic formula of renouncing vows at the most solemn time of the year when people are in the synagogue inspired, trying to change their lives, turn their lives around and come closer to God? Why would we want to engage in a legalistic formula? And we do it with such fervor, with such inspiration. There are many explanations. I'm only going to mention one, given by the Rogachover, one of the great geniuses of the 20th century, in which he says that there's a pattern we find in the Talmud, that whenever we had a ceremony, a ritual practice that involved the oral tradition, the rabbis always made a point of doing it with fanfare, doing it in public, doing it with gusto, doing it with a lot of enthusiasm, as a way of demonstrating that Judaism is only Judaism not because of what we have in the Torah, but the Torah is a split Torah. There's a written Torah and there's an oral Torah. And without the oral Torah, we cannot understand the written Torah. When the written Torah says an eye for an eye, the oral Torah says no, not literally an eye for an eye, the value of an eye. When the written Torah says do not do work on the Sabbath, it doesn't define what work is. The oral Torah tells us what is precisely a malacha, a form of work that is prohibited, and what is completely permissible. Likewise, every commandment in the Torah is supplemented and complemented by the oral tradition, without which we don't have Judaism. All of Judaism's flavor, not only the details of the laws, but the spirit of the laws, were passed down from one generation to another. Judaism is a living religion. It's not just people go to a book and they read the book and they follow the manual, but there's always been a connection to student, father to son, mother to daughter. All the generations have been involved in transmitting this knowledge. Without that, we don't have Judaism, and that's one of the reasons why we say Kol Nidre in public in the most solemn time of the year as a way of demonstrating that our commitment to Judaism is based on a living tradition where it's passed on from one generation to another, not just on a printed word. It's one of the reasons given. Another reason given is that one of the powers of a vow, annulling a vow, is that you can retroactively annul the vow. It's as if you never made that vow. And that's the same power of tshuva, of repentance. When a person repents, not only is it considered as if the crime that he committed or she committed is not held against him or her, it's considered to be unintentional, it's transformed into a mitzvah. The famous sage Rabbi Levi Yitzchak of Berditchev once invited the greatest sinner in town to his house. I believe it was the eve of Yom Kippur. And he says to him, I'm jealous of you. Jealous of me? Are you poking fun at me? And he said, you have so many sins. If you would repent, if you would return to God, those sins would all be transformed into mitzvahs, into virtues. I can never do as much. I can never fulfill as many mitzvahs as you have committed sins that are now going to be transformed into, converted into virtues. But there's one caveat. In order for the negatives of the past to be transformed into positives, the repenting, the returning has to be done and motivated by love. It can't be motivated by fear of punishment and retribution. It has to be based on love. You're so permeated with a sense of love for God that you have abandoned, and you want to get closer to Him. You have this thirst to get closer, regretting what you have done in the past. That turns the negatives into positives. And that is symbolized by that annulment of vows, where the negative, the vow that you have made, is no longer considered a vow. It has been transformed, completely neutralized, as if you never did it. The next Parsha, Masei, deals with the journeys of the Jewish people, the 42 journeys the Jewish people traveled through the desert. The way the Torah begins that portion is with the words, Eile Masei B'nei Yisrael. These are the journeys of the children of Israel. One of the great Sephardic sages of the 18th century pointed out that these four words, Eile, Masei, B'nei Yisrael, these are the journeys of the children of Israel, we take the first letters, the initials of these 4 words, it spells the initials of the 4 forms of exile that the Jewish people, historical periods of exile, we should say, that the Jewish people had to endure. The Aleph of the word, we'll start off with the Aleph, the first word, that stands for Edom. Edom is another way of referring to the Roman exile, the Romans who destroyed the Second Temple, and since that destruction we still are in exile until we see the Third Temple built very speedily, imminently. But we are still part of that exile of Edom, and we are now entering into the month of Av. Tonight is the first day, the Rosh Chodesh, the first of the month of Av, in which we observe the fast day on Tisha B'Av, the 9th of Av, commemorating the destruction of the 2 temples and many other tragedies. But we also have the name for this month, and it's called Menachem Av, the consolation of the Father. This is God is the Father, and this is the month in which not only did He bring upon us all these disasters, but He also brought upon us and has given us the potential to transform them into days of rejoicing and festivities. So that's the Aleph of Elah, these, referring to Edom, the last exile. The next word, Masei, begins with the letter Mem, which is the initial of the word Madai. The Persian exile was actually 2 countries that joined together to persecute the Jewish people. The Persian Empire was also part of the Median Empire. Mede and Persia, Madai in Hebrew, that's what the Mem stands for. And that was the exile in which Haman obtained the permission to have all the Jews annihilated during one day. And that's why we have the holiday of Purim, when that was defeated. So the Mem, the word Masei, the journeys, is a reference to the exile, the Persian or the Median exile. The next word, B'nai, the children of, begins with the letter Beis, which is the initial of the word Bavel, Babylonia. That refers to the Babylonian exile by Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylonia, who destroyed the first temple and drove the Jews into exile that lasted for 70 years. And finally, the Yud of the word Yisrael stands for Yavan, the Greek exile, the Greeks who have persecuted the Jews and tried to take away their religion from them. And that's why we have the holiday of Hanukkah. Now it's interesting that these 4 empires, these 4 forms of exile, are also hinted on the dreidel that we play in Hanukkah. You wouldn't think that we'd have a reference to Hanukkah in the middle of the summer, but Hanukkah we have the dreidel that has the 4 letters on it, Nun, Gimel, He, Shin, and some of the great mystical sages, Hasidic masters, have said that those 4 letters correspond to the 4 empires. You have the Nun, which stands for Nefesh, the soul. The Babylonians destroyed our temple. They tried to destroy our soul. Then you have the Gimel. The Gimel stands for Guf. Persians tried to destroy our body. Haman tried to annihilate us. He was directing his venom against our body more than our soul. Then you have the Greeks. They are Shin. Shin stands for Seichel, intellect. They were fighting against our ideology. They tried to impose their secular, pagan ideology on us. And then you have the Roman Empire, which is He, stands for Hakol, everything. They combined all the other ills and forms of persecution. But since the Roman Empire took over and all of its offshoots, Christendom, Islam, and all the other forces under which the Jews had to live, they did everything. They tried to destroy our soul. They tried to destroy our ideology. They tried to destroy our bodies. They combined all of those things. And when it talks about these are the journeys of the Jewish people, it's talking about the journeys outside of these forms of exile. We are finally coming to the end of this journey, and we will soon be celebrating the holiday, the festive holiday of Tisha B'Av, with Mashiach at our head in the 3rd Beis HaMikdash. Have a good evening, a good Shabbos, good Rosh Chodesh, and this should be indeed a month of consolation.